Hans Muller stared at the cowboy boots in his trembling hands. The leather was soft, supple, the color of Texas sunset. 2 weeks ago, he would have burned them. Today, standing in the supply shed of Camp Hearn with dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, he was crying. The American guard, Jake Thompson, stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, saying nothing. Just watching, waiting. This was not supposed to happen. The enemy was not supposed to be kind. 2 years, 730 days since Hans had felt the sand of North Africa beneath his Wehrmacht boots, since British artillery had torn through his unit at Tunisia, since he had raised his hands in surrender and become something less than a soldier. Something he had no name for. The propaganda films in Hamburg had never shown him this. Goebbels had never prepared him for the moment when an American guard would offer him boots from his own closet and ask nothing in return. May 1945. Germany had surrendered 2 weeks prior. The radio broadcast from Berlin had stopped. The Reich was ash, and here in the heart of Texas, in a prisoner of war camp surrounded by cotton fields and mesquite trees, a 28-year-old German sergeant was learning that everything he had believed for 7 years might have been a lie. Let us go back. Let us understand how a baker's son from Hamburg came to stand in a supply shed 4,000 miles from home, holding boots that would change the trajectory of his entire life. Hamburg, 1938. The city smelled of fresh bread and coal smoke. Wilhelm Muller's bakery sat on the corner of Langerreihe, 3 stories of red brick with white shutters and a painted sign that had hung there since 1902. Hans, 21 years old, strong-shouldered from kneading dough since age 12, was learning the family trade. His father's hands, white with flour, showed him how to shape pumpernickel, how to judge the oven temperature by feel, how to price fairly so customers returned. The future was certain. Hans would inherit the bakery. He would marry Elsa from the butcher shop. They would have children who would learn to make bread. Life was simple. Life was good. Then came the draft notice. Wehrmacht needed soldiers. Hitler needed soldiers. The Reich needed soldiers. And Hans Muller, despite his protests, despite his father's pleas at the conscription office, was no longer a baker. He was a private in the German army, shipping east to training camp with a rifle he barely knew how to hold. The war that followed was nothing like the parades. North Africa was heat and sand and fear. The British were better equipped, better fed, better everything. Hans watched friends die in the desert sun. He learned to shoot. He learned to kill. He learned that survival meant not thinking too hard about the faces on the other side of the rifle sights. Then Tunisia. May 1943. The artillery came at dawn. The world exploded into noise and dust and screaming metal. When the smoke cleared, half his unit was dead and the rest were surrounded. An officer, blood streaming from a head wound, gave the order Hans never thought he would hear. Surrender. Hands up. Rifle down. The slow walk toward British lines with heart hammering so hard he thought it would break through his ribs. The British soldiers were younger than expected. They looked tired. They looked almost relieved that no more shooting was necessary. Processing, questions, medical examination. The shrapnel in Hans's left shoulder was removed by a British doctor who worked with the same care he would have given his own soldiers. This was the first crack in the foundation of everything Hans had been taught. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The enemy was supposed to exact revenge. Instead, they gave him morphine for the pain. Transfer to American custody came in September 1943. A ship across the Atlantic packed with German prisoners, all of them silent, with shock and shame. They expected labor camps. They expected starvation. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were soft, yes, but they were also vindictive. They would make the prisoners suffer. The ship docked in New York. The Germans were loaded onto trains heading south. Hans pressed his face to the window, watching America roll past. Farmland, towns with churches, civilians who looked well-fed, who looked at peace. Where was the suffering the newsreels had promised? Where was the collapsing nation, drowning in its own weakness, Texas? September 1943. The heat hit like a physical force when the train doors opened. Guards in American uniforms stood waiting, rifles ready, but pointed at the ground. No shouting, no violence. Just orders clear and firm. Welcome to Camp Hearn. The camp sprawled across the Texas grassland, row after row of whitewashed barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers at each corner. American flags snapping in the wind. Hans and 400 other prisoners marched through the gates where assigned bunks given prison uniforms told the rules. The rules were strange. Geneva Convention would be followed. Prisoners would work but would be paid. 80 cents per day in camp scrip. Medical care would be provided. Letters could be sent home once per month. Religious services were available. Violence would not be tolerated. Hans, standing in the barracks that first night, tried to process this. His bunk had a real mattress. The latrine had running water. Through the window he could see the mess hall, and the smell of cooking food drifted on the evening air. Klaus Weber, a 24-year-old private from Berlin who had been assigned the bunk beside Hans, spoke what they were all thinking. This does not make sense. The first breakfast at Camp Hearn broke something in Hans Muller's understanding of the world. September 19th, 1943. The prisoners lined up outside the mess hall, metal trays in hand, expecting the gruel and black bread that had been standard rations in the Wehrmacht for the past 2 years. Instead, American cooks piled eggs onto his tray, real eggs scrambled and steaming, bacon crispy at the edges, toast with butter, a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee, not the acorn substitute Germany had been drinking since 1942, a small glass of orange juice. Hans stood frozen in the serving line. The man behind him nudged forward. Hans moved to a table, sat down, stared at his tray. Klaus sat across from him. They looked at each other. Neither spoke. Hans picked up his fork. The eggs were hot, seasoned with salt and pepper. The bacon crunched between his teeth, rich and fatty and real. The coffee was bitter in exactly the right way. His hands started shaking. This was more food than he had seen on a plate in a year. This was more food than German civilians were getting. This was more food than the Wehrmacht had been feeding its own soldiers. Around the mess hall, 400 German prisoners ate in stunned silence. After breakfast, a young American lieutenant stood at the front of the hall and explained in careful German the camp policies. Prisoners would be assigned to work details. Some would work in the camp itself, maintaining facilities and cooking. Others would work on local farms and ranches, helping with the harvest. Payment would be made weekly. Good behavior would be rewarded with additional privileges. Poor behavior would result in loss of privileges, but not physical punishment. The lieutenant paused, looked at the assembled prisoners, and said something Hans would remember for the rest of his life. We do not believe in cruelty. We believe in dignity, even for our enemies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Hans returned to his bunk, lay down, and tried to reconcile the two realities. The propaganda had said Americans were barbaric, materialistic, spiritually empty. The propaganda had said German soldiers captured by Americans would be worked to death. Instead, he had just eaten the best breakfast of his life. That night, Hans started a diary, a small notebook he had been allowed to keep, a pencil provided by the camp. On the first page, he wrote a single question: why the days became weeks. Fall turned to winter. Hans was assigned to the camp wood shop where prisoners built furniture and repaired equipment. He was good with his hands. Years of shaping dough had taught him patience and precision. The American supervisor, a sergeant from Oklahoma, showed him how to use the power tools, then left him alone to work. The routine was steady: wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work from 8 to 4, dinner at 5. Free time until lights out at 10. On Sundays there was church. A Lutheran chaplain from the American Army led services in German. Hans attended because it reminded him of home, of the church his mother had taken him to every Sunday before the war. Letters arrived from Anna, his sister. The first one came in December 1943. She was alive. Their mother was alive. Their father was still running the bakery, though flour was rationed and ingredients were scarce. Hamburg had been bombed twice in the past 6 months. Many buildings were destroyed. Many people were dead. But the Mueller family, by some miracle, had survived. Anna wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. She did not mention politics. She did not mention Hitler. She only said she missed him and hoped he was safe. Hans wrote back. He did not tell her about the eggs and bacon. He did not tell her that his American captors treated him better than his own officers had. He only said he was healthy and thought of home every day. The months passed: spring 1944, summer, fall again. News of the war filtered into camp through radio broadcasts the guards did not bother to hide. D-Day, the liberation of France. the Allied advance into Germany. Each victory for America was another nail in the coffin of everything Hans had fought for. Some prisoners refused to accept it. A small group of hardcore Nazis led by an SS officer named Ernst Keller insisted the reports were propaganda. Germany would rally. Secret weapons would turn the tide. The Führer had a plan. Hans said nothing in these debates. He worked in the wood shop. He ate his meals. He wrote letters home. He watched the American guards and tried to understand them. One guard in particular caught his attention. Jake Thompson was different from the others. He was older, 42, with lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the Texas sun. He did not carry himself like a soldier. He carried himself like a rancher, which Hans would later learn he was. Jake Thompson had owned 300 acres outside Bryan, Texas since 1928, cattle and horses mostly. Some wheat. He had two sons, 16 and 14, and a wife named Mary who taught school in town. When Pearl Harbor happened, Jake tried to enlist. Too old, they said, but they needed guards for the new POW camp being built. That he could do. Jake did not hate Germans. His grandfather had been German immigrated in 1889, homesteaded in Texas, married a local woman. Jake grew up hearing German phrases mixed with English. He understood more of what the prisoners said than they realized. What Jake did hate was the war. His older brother, a Navy ensign, had died at Pearl Harbor, burned alive when the Arizona went down. Jake had received the telegram 3 days before Christmas, 1941. His mother never recovered. She died 6 months later of what the doctor called heart failure, but what Jake knew was a broken heart. So Jake Thompson had every reason to hate the German soldiers in his care. But he did not, because Jake believed in something his father had taught him. You judge a man by his actions, not by the uniform he was forced to wear. Hans and Jake first spoke in October 1944. Hans was repairing a table leg in the wood shop when Jake walked in inspecting the facility. He stopped at Hans's workbench, watched him work for a moment. The craftsmanship was excellent. Hans was using a traditional German joinery technique, creating a connection that would hold for decades without nails or glue. Jake, in his rough German, said, "Good work." Hans looked up surprised. Guards rarely complimented prisoners. Jake continued in English this time. "Where did you learn this?" Hans understood English better than he let on. 2 months with British prisoners during his initial capture had taught him the basics. 6 months in Camp Hearn hearing English every day had improved his comprehension considerably, but he was careful not to reveal this skill. Knowledge was power even in a prison camp. He responded in halting English. "My grandfather, he had carpentry shop in Hamburg." Jake nodded. "Runs in the family then." A pause. Then Jake asked, "You have family still in Hamburg?" Hans hesitated. This felt like a trick question, but Jake's face showed only genuine curiosity. "Yes, mother, sister, father has bakery." Jake's expression shifted. Something like understanding, maybe sympathy. "Bakery. My wife's father was a baker, died in 1940. She still misses the smell." Another pause. The moment stretched out, two men from opposite sides of a war finding unexpected common ground over bread and carpentry. Jake nodded once more and walked away, but something had shifted. From that day forward, when Jake did his rounds, he would stop at Hans's workbench. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just stood in companionable silence while Hans worked and Jake watched. Winter 1945 arrived. News from Germany grew worse. The Allied armies were pushing deep into the fatherland. Cities were falling. The war was clearly lost. Even Keller, the SS officer, had stopped insisting on an ultimate victory. Now he just insisted on faithful resistance to the end. Hans received a letter from Anna in March 1945. The envelope was thinner than usual. Inside, just one page. The bakery was gone. Allied bombs had hit their street in February. Father had been inside preparing for the next day's baking. He died instantly. Mother was alive but had lost her home. Anna was living in a refugee center working in a British mess hall to earn food rations. The letter ended with a single line that made Hans's hands shake. "We are surviving on food from American aid packages. The same country you have fought against is keeping us alive." Hans sat on his bunk for hours, the letter in his lap, trying to process this. Father was dead. The bakery, 3 generations of Muller labor, was rubble. His mother was homeless. His sister was dependent on British charity, and the Americans, the enemy, were feeding them. What had the war been for? What had any of it been for? Klaus found him that evening, still sitting, still holding the letter. Hans, are you all right? Hans looked up. His face was dry, but his eyes were hollow. My father is dead. Klaus sat down beside him. They had been bunkmates for 18 months now. Not quite friends, but something close. Survivors who understood each other. I am sorry. Americans are feeding my family. Klaus nodded slowly. Mine too. My mother wrote last month. She says the American soldiers in Berlin are giving children chocolate. They sat in silence. Outside, the Texas sun was setting, painting the barracks walls gold and crimson. Tomorrow they would wake up and work and eat and sleep just like always. But something fundamental had broken. The narrative they had been told, the story that had given their suffering meaning, was revealed as a lie. The Americans were not the villains. Maybe they never had been. May 1945. The 8th of May. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers at noon. Hans was working in the woodshop when the American national anthem started playing. He stepped outside and saw the guards gathering near the flagpole, standing at attention. The music ended. A voice speaking in both English and German declared that the Third Reich had ceased to exist. Around the camp, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some cried, some stood frozen. Some, like Keller, retreated to the barracks in silent fury. Hans simply sat down on the woodshop steps and watched the American flag snap in the wind. It was over. 7 years of war, 4 continents, tens of millions dead, and it was finally over. The strange thing was how little changed in Camp Hearn. The routine continued. Work details still went out. Meals were still served. The only difference was the guards seemed more relaxed. The tension that had hummed beneath every interaction was gone. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late May, Hans stood at roll call with his boots falling apart. The boots he had worn since North Africa through 2 years of sand and combat and prison camp had finally given up. The soles flapped when he walked. The leather had cracked beyond repair. There were holes where his toes pushed through. Jake Thompson was conducting the morning inspection. He walked down the line of prisoners, checking uniforms, looking for contraband, ensuring everything was in order. When he reached Hans, he stopped. His eyes dropped to the ruined boots. Muller, those boots are done. Come by the supply shed after lunch. Hans opened his mouth to respond, but Jake had already moved on. At 1 in the afternoon, Hans walked to the supply shed with a feeling of dread in his stomach. This felt like a setup. Nobody gave prisoners new boots out of kindness. There would be a catch. Extra work duty. Confession of some violation. Something. Jake was waiting inside the shed, standing beside a cardboard box on the shelf. Try these, please. He handed the box to Hans. Inside were cowboy boots, real leather, tan-colored, hardly worn. The stitching was intact. The heels were solid. They were beautiful. Hans stared at them, then at Jake, then back at the boots. I cannot accept this. Why not? Because, Hans struggled for the words, because you are my enemy. Jake's expression did not change. He looked at Hans for a long moment, then spoke quietly. War's over, son. Germany surrendered 2 weeks ago. You're not my enemy anymore. You're just a man with bad boots. He nodded at the box. Those were mine. Bought them in 1941, but they were too stiff. Never broke them in. Been sitting in my closet ever since. Better you wear them than they go to waste. Hans looked down at the boots. His throat felt tight. This was not how enemies behaved. This was not what the propaganda had promised. His voice cracked. He tried again. I do not understand. Jake's face softened. I know you don't, but you will. Hans took the boots. They fit perfectly. The leather was soft against his feet, supportive where his old boots had collapsed. He stood up, took a few steps, felt the difference immediately. Jake watched him walk. Good, Hans nodded, unable to speak. Something was breaking inside him. Some wall he had built to survive the past 7 years was cracking under the weight of this simple act of kindness. Thank you, he managed finally. Jake just nodded. Get back to your detail. Hans walked out of the supply shed wearing boots that had been in his enemy's closet, and for the first time since Tunisia, since surrender, since the world had turned upside down, He felt something that might have been hope. That evening in the mess hall, Hans sat with his metal tray and tried not to think about the boots. Tried not to think about Jake's face when he said the war was over. Tried not to think about what any of this meant. Dinner was fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and apple pie. Standard American fare. Hans had eaten it dozens of times by now. He should have been used to it. But that night there was something extra on his tray. 3 strips of bacon, fresh cooked, still warm, laid across the edge of his plate like an afterthought. Hans stared at the bacon. He had not had real bacon since 1941, since before the war consumed everything. Since Sunday mornings in his father's kitchen when Wilhelm would fry up the good cuts and the whole family would eat together before church. He picked up a strip. The smell hit him first. Smoky, salty, rich with fat. Then the taste. The crispy edges gave way to tender meat grease, coating his tongue, flavor exploding in his mouth. And Hans Mueller, 28-year-old Wehrmacht sergeant, prisoner of war, survivor of North Africa and Tunisia, and 2 years of captivity, started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears running down his face while he chewed bacon and remembered his father and realized his father was dead and the bakery was gone and Hamburg was rubble and the Americans were feeding him better than his own government ever had. Klaus, sitting across the table, saw it happen. He reached over, put a hand on Hans's arm. Said nothing. What was there to say? Other prisoners noticed. Some looked away, embarrassed. Some nodded in understanding. They all knew. They all felt it. The impossible contradiction of being treated with dignity by the people they had been taught to hate. Hans finished his bacon. He ate the chicken and potatoes. He ate the apple pie. And the whole time tears kept falling. Not from sadness exactly. From something deeper. From the collapse of everything he thought he knew about good and evil, about enemies and allies, about what this war had meant. That night, lying in his bunk with the cowboy boots beside him, Hans wrote in his diary, "Today an American gave me boots and fed me bacon. My father is dead because of American bombs. How do I reconcile these things? How do I understand that the enemy can be cruel and kind at the same time? Or am I the one who has been wrong all along?" He underlined the last question twice. Then he closed the diary, turned off the light, and lay in the darkness, wearing boots that had belonged to his captor and wondering what kind of man he was becoming. June 1945. The Texas heat arrived like an occupying army, relentless and total. By 10 in the morning, the temperature inside the barracks pushed past 90 degrees. By noon, 100. The prisoners moved slowly through their work details, conserving energy, drinking water from canteens refilled every hour. Hans worked at the wood shop with his shirt soaked through sawdust, sticking to his arms. The cowboy boots Jake had given him were broken in now, comfortable as slippers. He caught himself looking down at them, sometimes still unable to fully process the gift. Every time he tied the laces, he thought of Jake standing in the supply shed holding out the box with no expectation of gratitude or repayment. Just kindness. Simple as that. Complicated as that. The mail came on a Wednesday afternoon. Klaus brought the letter to the wood shop, found Hans bent over a cabinet he was building for the camp commander's office. "From your sister." Hans wiped sawdust from his hands, took the envelope. Anna's handwriting looked shakier than usual. The paper was cheap, thin enough to see through. He sat on the workbench and opened it carefully. The first line stopped his breathing. "Mother is alive." Hans read it twice to be sure. Alive. Greta Mueller had survived. She was in a refugee camp near Bremen in the British-occupied zone. Sick with pneumonia but recovering. Anna had found her 3 weeks ago, had been trying to get permission to bring her to Hamburg, but the bureaucracy was impossible. Everything was impossible now. Germany was divided, occupied, starving. The American zone had the most food. The Russian zone had the most violence. The British zone, where their mother coughed in a tent with 300 other displaced people, was somewhere in between. Hans kept reading. Anna had found work cooking for British soldiers. The pay was minimal, but she got 2 meals a day and could sometimes bring home scraps for their mother. She had applied for ration cards. She had written to the Red Cross. She was doing everything possible, but it was not enough. It was never enough. The next paragraph made Hans's hands shake. The Americans send food packages through the relief organizations. White bread, canned meat, powdered milk. Without these packages, Mother would have starved already. I know you fought against them. I know you believed in the Reich. But Hans, the Americans are keeping our mother alive. I do not understand this war anymore. I do not understand anything. Hans folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and sat very still. Through the woodshop window, he could see American guards walking their rounds, could see the mess hall where tonight he would eat pot roast and boiled carrots and fresh rolls, could see the flagpole with the stars and stripes hanging limp in the still air. His mother was alive because Americans were feeding her. His sister was alive because the British were employing her. And he, the soldier who had tried to kill these people, was living in better conditions than he had known in the Wehrmacht. Klaus appeared beside him. Bad news? No. Hans looked up. My mother lives. That is good news. Yes, Hans touched the envelope. Americans are feeding her. Relief packages. Anna says without them, Mother would be dead. Klaus nodded slowly. They had both received letters like this now, stories of survival built on the charity of former enemies. It was becoming a common theme among the prisoners whispered in the barracks at night. The cognitive dissonance was collective. Do you ever wonder, Klaus said carefully, if we were the villains? Hans looked at him. Neither spoke for a long moment. To voice such a thought even 6 months ago would have been dangerous. Keller and his Nazi loyalists would have reported it. Men had been beaten for less. But the war was over. The Reich was dead. And the question hung in the air between them, unavoidable and terrible. Yes, Hans said finally. I wonder. That evening, Jake Thompson found Hans sitting alone behind the woodshop, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The day's heat was finally breaking. A breeze moved through the camp, carrying the smell of sage and dust. Muller, Jake stood at a respectful distance away. You working through lunch? Everything all right? Hans considered lying, considered saying he was fine, just tired from the heat. But something about Jake's presence, about the way he asked questions like he actually wanted to know the answers, made honesty feel possible. I received letter from sister today. My mother is alive. That's good news. Yes, she lives because Americans send food, relief packages. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the ground beside Hans, which no guard had ever done before. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered one. Hans took it. They smoked in silence while the sun dropped toward the horizon. My older brother died at Pearl Harbor, Jake said eventually. Ensign on the Arizona. He burned to death when the ship went down. I got the telegram, December 23rd, 1941. Worst Christmas of my life. Hans looked at him, shocked that Jake would share this. I tell you this because you need to understand something. Jake exhaled smoke, watched it drift away. I got every reason to hate Germans. Every reason to make your life here hell. But that would not bring my brother back, and it would not make me anything but bitter. He turned to look at Hans directly. You did not kill my brother. Japanese pilots did. And even if you had fought in the Pacific, even if you had been on one of those planes, the war's over now. Hate does not end just because the shooting stops. You got to choose to let it go. But how? Hans heard the desperation in his own voice. How do I let go of 7 years? How do I accept that everything I fought for was wrong? Jake stubbed out his cigarette in the dirt. One day at a time, one choice at a time, starting with small things, like accepting a pair of boots from someone who should be your enemy, but chooses to be something else instead. The words settled into Hans like stones in water sinking deep. He thought of his father's bakery, of Wilhelm's patient hands teaching him to knead dough. His father had believed in simple things: hard work, fair dealing, kindness to neighbors. Those beliefs had not included war or empire or racial superiority. Those had been added later, imposed from above, and Wilhelm had accepted them because everyone else did, and questioning meant danger. What would his father think now, seeing his son wearing American boots and eating American food, and slowly, terrifyingly beginning to admire American values? Jake. Hans used the first name consciously, deliberately. Why you give me boots? Jake stood up, dusted off his pants. Because your old ones were shot and I had a pair sitting unused, that is all. Sometimes kindness does not need a reason beyond the obvious. He walked a few steps, then turned back. We are doing a work detail at my ranch starting Monday, rotating duty 2 weeks at a time. I requested you be on the list. You know horses? You know carpentry. I can use the help. Hans nodded. I will work hard. I know you will. Jake nodded once and walked away, leaving Hans alone with the sunset and the weight of too many questions. Monday morning, Hans and 5 other prisoners loaded into a truck for transport to Jake Thompson's ranch. The drive took 20 minutes through empty Texas grassland, past oil derricks and cattle and long stretches of nothing. Hans sat in the truck bed feeling the wind on his face, watching America roll past, and thinking how strange it was that this enemy nation looked so peaceful, so ordinary. The ranch was 300 acres of rolling prairie with a white farmhouse, a red barn, wooden corrals for horses and cattle. As the truck pulled up the long driveway, Hans saw 2 teenage boys stop their work and stare. Jake's sons. Billy, 16, tall and lanky. Tom, 14, stockier with his father's square jaw. A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. Mary Thompson was 38, brown hair pulled back, face weathered from sun and wind, but smiling. She carried a tray with glasses of lemonade, walked right up to the prisoners as they climbed out of the truck. It is 95 degrees already, she said, offering the tray. You all need to hydrate. Hans took a glass, stared at it. Real lemonade. Cold. With actual lemon slices floating in it. Thank you, ma'am. Mary startled slightly. You speak English? Hans felt heat rise to his face, realized his mistake. He had been so careful to hide his understanding, but the gesture of kindness had surprised him into responding naturally. Little bit, he said carefully. I learned from British in North Africa. Mary smiled. Well, that will make things easier. She gestured toward the barn. My husband will show you what needs doing. When you break for lunch, come to the house. I will have sandwiches ready. She walked back inside, and Hans stood holding cold lemonade in his hands, thinking about how this woman's brother-in-law had died at Pearl Harbor, and yet she offered prisoners drinks and spoke to them like human beings. The work was hard but satisfying. Fence posts to repair cattle, to move hay to stack in the barn. Hans worked alongside Klaus and 3 other prisoners, all of them quiet, and all of them processing this new environment. No barbed wire, no guard towers, just open land and honest labor, and Jake Thompson watching from a distance, making sure they knew what to do, but not hovering. At noon, Mary called them to the porch. She had made roast beef sandwiches, potato salad, fresh baked cookies, and sweet tea so cold, it made Hans's teeth ache. The prisoners sat on the porch steps eating food better than most restaurants in pre-war Hamburg. Billy and Tom sat nearby, curious but cautious. Tom, the younger one, kept staring at Hans's boots. Those are Dad's old boots, he said finally. Hans looked down at them. Yes, your father gave to me. My boots were broken. Tom considered this. He said, you know about horses. My grandfather had horses, in Hamburg, long time ago. Can you ride? Hans hesitated. I have not ridden since I was boy. Billy spoke up, older and more confident. We got a horse that needs exercising. Ranger. He is particular about who he trusts. Maybe you could try. After lunch, Hans found himself walking toward the corral with Jake and both boys. Inside, a quarter horse stood alert, ears forward. Reddish-brown coat, black mane, and intelligent eyes that tracked movement carefully. Ranger is 12 years old, Jake explained. Trained him myself, but he got opinions about people. Does not trust easy. Hans approached the fence, slowly moving the way his grandfather had taught him. 60 years ago felt like a lifetime. Keep your hands visible. Move with confidence, but not aggression. Let the horse decide. Ranger watched him. Hans reached the fence, extended his hand, palm up, waited. The horse took 2 steps forward, nostrils flaring, reading Hans's scent and energy. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ranger walked directly to Hans and pressed his nose into his palm. Jake laughed, genuinely amazed. Well, I'll be damned. Ranger don't trust nobody that quick. Hans stroked the horse's face, feeling the soft muzzle, the warmth of breath against his hand. Something inside him unlocked. A memory of being 10 years old, standing in his grandfather's stable in Hamburg, learning to curry horses before the morning ride, before the war, before everything broke. You want to take him out? Jake opened the gate. Hans rode Ranger that afternoon through the Texas grassland, with Billy and Tom flanking him on their own horses. They showed him the property boundaries, the good water sources, the places where coyotes sometimes bothered the cattle. Hans said little but absorbed everything. The feel of a horse beneath him, the wind in his face, the sun on his shoulders. For 2 hours, he was not a prisoner. He was just a man on a horse in a landscape too big for borders. When they returned to the corral, Hans dismounted and spent extra time brushing Ranger down, checking his hooves, making sure he was properly cooled. Jake watched from the fence. "You could have run," Jake said quietly. "Mexico is 200 miles south. You could have taken a Ranger and been gone before we noticed." Hans looked at him, surprised Jake would acknowledge this. "Where would I go?" Hans said. "Hamburg is destroyed. I have no papers, no money, and—" He paused, searching for words. "I gave word. I work here. German soldier keeps his word." Jake studied him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "So does American rancher. You work hard, I will treat you fair. Deal." Hans looked at the offered hand. This was more than a handshake. This was an acknowledgement of mutual respect between former enemies. This was choosing to see the human before the uniform. He took Jake's hand, shook it firmly. Deal. That night back in the barracks, Hans could not sleep. He lay in his bunk thinking about the day, about Mary's lemonade and the beef sandwiches and Ranger's trust, about shaking Jake Thompson's hand and meaning it, about becoming someone his past self would not recognize. Klaus's voice came from the neighboring bunk. "Hans, you are awake." "Yes." "Today was strange." "Yes." "They treated us like people." "Yes." A long silence. Then Klaus said what they were both thinking. "I do not want to hate them anymore. I am tired of hating." Hans closed his eyes. "Me too." 2 weeks later, Ernst Keller cornered Hans behind the mess hall. The SS officer was 35, hard-faced, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing. He stood with two other Nazi loyalists blocking Hans's path. "Muller," Keller's voice was cold. "We need to talk." Hans set down the crate of supplies he was carrying. "About what?" "About your collaboration." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Hans felt his pulse quicken. "I am not collaborating. I am working." "You are wearing American boots." Keller pointed at Hans's feet. "You are eating their food. You are working on their ranches. You shake hands with the guards." "The war is over." "The war is never over." Keller stepped closer. "Germany will rise again. The Reich will return. And when it does, collaborators like you will answer for your betrayal." Something snapped inside Hans. 7 years of following orders. 7 years of believing lies. 7 years of killing and dying for a cause that had led to his father's death and his city's destruction, and his mother living in a refugee camp sustained by American charity. "The Reich is dead," Hans said quietly. "It lost. We lost. And good men died because madmen like you convinced them it was glorious." Keller's face went white with rage. "You dare! My father is dead because of Allied bombs. But my mother lives because of American food. Which side was right, Keller? Which side showed mercy?" Keller shoved Hans hard. Hans stumbled back, caught himself. Keller advanced. "You are a traitor to Germany." "I was loyal to Germany." Hans shoved back. "I fought for 7 years, but Germany betrayed us. The government betrayed us. They sent us to die for nothing." Keller swung. His fist caught Hans on the jaw. Hans tasted blood. Then muscle memory from 2 years of combat took over. He blocked the next punch, countered with one of his own. His knuckles connected with Keller's cheekbone. Other prisoners emerged from the mess hall. Some moved to break up the fight. Others took sides. Within seconds, it was a full brawl, Nazi loyalists against those ready to accept the new reality. American guards rushed in, blowing whistles, pulling men apart. Hans found himself face down in the dirt with a guard's knee on his back. Keller was similarly restrained 10 feet away, still shouting about traitors and the coming Reich restoration. The camp commander, a weary captain named Morrison, surveyed the scene. Solitary confinement. 3 days. Both of them. The cell was 8 feet by 10 concrete floor, metal cot, single bucket in the corner. No windows. A bare bulb in the ceiling that never turned off. Hans sat on the cot and felt the silence press against his ears. 3 days. 72 hours. 4,320 minutes alone with his thoughts. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were split from hitting Keller. There was blood on his shirt. His jaw throbbed where he had been hit. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the internal crisis. The cowboy boots sat beside the cot. Hans picked one up, ran his fingers over the leather. Jake had given him these, had treated him with dignity, had offered him work and respect in something that looked very much like friendship. And Hans had just gotten into a fistfight with another prisoner over whether accepting that kindness constituted betrayal. He set the boot down carefully. In the harsh light of the cell, Hans Muller confronted the central question of his existence. What am I, German soldier, American prisoner, either both? What do I become when everything I believed is revealed as lies, day 2 of confinement? Hans was lying on the cot staring at the ceiling when the cell door opened. He sat up, expecting a guard with food. Instead, Jake Thompson walked in carrying a paper bag and 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. The door closed behind him. Jake sat on the floor back against the wall and opened the bag. Brought you lunch, Mary made extra. He handed Hans a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Fried chicken on white bread. Hans took it numbly. Why are you here? Jake opened his Coca-Cola, took a sip. Heard you stood up to Keller. That Nazi bastard been causing trouble since he arrived. Someone needed to knock him down a peg. Hans unwrapped the sandwich but did not eat. He says I am traitor. Traitor to what? A government that sent you to die in Africa, that bombed your own cities, that killed your father. The words hit like physical blows. Hans looked at Jake. I do not know what I am anymore. Jake was quiet for a moment. You are a man trying to figure out what comes next. That is all any of us are. He pulled a cigarette pack from his pocket, offered one. They smoked in the cell, the smoke curling up toward the bare bulb. Japan surrendered last month, Jake said. War is truly over now. Prisoners will start going home soon. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year. Eventually you will return to Hamburg. Hans nodded. There is nothing to return to. Then you build something new. Jake looked at him directly. That is what Americans do. We build. After the revolution, we built a nation. After the Civil War, we rebuilt the South. After this war, we will help rebuild Europe, including Germany. Why we were your enemies? Were, past tense. Jake stubbed out his cigarette. Listen, Hans, I am going to make you an offer. When you go home, when you help your mother and sister get settled, when you do what you need to do for your family, I want you to come back here. Legal immigration, work my ranch, I will sponsor you. Pay fair wages, teach you everything about cattle and horses in Texas. Standing offer. No expiration date. Hans stared at him, unable to process this. Why would you do this? Because you are a good man who fought for the wrong side. War is over. Good men should not go to waste. Jake stood up, collected the empty bottles. Think about it. You got time. Germany's rebuilding will take years. He knocked on the door. The guard opened it. Jake walked out, leaving Hans alone with a half-eaten sandwich and a choice that would define the rest of his life. October 1945. The heat had finally broken. Autumn in Texas brought cooler mornings, winds that carried the smell of approaching rain. Hans Muller walked out of solitary confinement after 3 days and found the world had shifted in ways he could not have predicted. The fight with Keller had created a division in the camp, not along national lines or military ranks, but along something more fundamental. Those who could let go of the past and those who could not. Those willing to accept kindness from former enemies and those who saw such acceptance as betrayal. Hans discovered to his surprise that more prisoners fell into the first category than the second. Klaus met him outside the barracks. Welcome back. You missed the announcement. What announcement? Repatriation begins in January. They are sending us home in groups. Oldest prisoners, first then by rank, then by good behavior. Klaus smiled slightly. You and I are in the March group. 5 months from now, we go back to Germany. Hans absorbed this. 5 months, 150 days. Then Hamburg. Then his mother and Anna. Then the ruins of everything he had known. Did you decide, Klaus asked quietly, about Thompson's offer? Hans had told no one about Jake's proposal, but Klaus was observant and the walls in the barracks were thin. I do not know yet. If you go back to America after Germany, I understand. There is nothing left for us there. Not really. They walked to the mess hall in silence. Hans thought about Jake's words in the cell. You are a man trying to figure out what comes next. But figuring out what came next required understanding what had come before, and Hans was still wrestling with that fundamental question. The camp commander approved Hans for full-time work detail at the Thompson Ranch. Every day for the next 4 months, Hans would ride the truck out to those 300 acres of Texas grassland and learn what it meant to build something instead of destroy it. Jake taught him things Wilhelm Muller had never known. How to mend a fence so it would hold for 20 years. How to read weather in the clouds. How to gentle a skittish calf. How to repair leather tack using techniques passed down from Jake's grandfather, the German immigrant who had homesteaded this land in 1889. The irony was not lost on Hans, a German teaching a German through an American intermediary across 50 years, and an ocean and a war that had tried to erase such connections. Mary Thompson fed him lunch every day, always something different: pot roast and potatoes, fried catfish with hush puppies, chicken fried steak with gravy. She talked to him about her father, the baker, about how she missed the smell of rising dough. Hans told her about Wilhelm's bakery, about the pumpernickel recipe that had been in the family for 3 generations, about Sunday mornings when the whole neighborhood would line up before dawn for fresh rolls. "You should open a bakery when you go home," Mary said one afternoon, handing him a glass of sweet tea. "Rebuild your father's shop. I do not have money, or supplies, or building. But you have the knowledge. That is worth more than money." She smiled. "My father always said a good baker could start over with nothing but flour and fire. Everything else was just details." Hans thought about this while working. Could he rebuild? Should he? Wilhelm had spent 40 years creating something beautiful, and British bombs had destroyed it in seconds. What was the point of building when everything could be erased so easily? But then he would look at the fence he was mending, at the gate he was hanging, at the corral he was reinforcing, and he would think, this is building too. This is creating something that will last. Maybe that is the point. You build anyway despite the bombs, despite the war, despite the certainty that nothing lasts forever. November brought Thanksgiving. Jake invited Hans to the ranch for the day, cleared it with the camp commander, drove him out personally. The house smelled of roasting turkey, of pies, baking, of all the abundance that America seemed to create effortlessly, even after years of global war. The Thompson family gathered around the table. Jake and Mary, Billy, and Tom. Mary's sister and her husband, neighbors from the next ranch over. 10 people total, counting Hans. They held hands for grace, and Hans, who had not prayed since his father died, bowed his head and listened to Jake thank God for peace, for harvest, for the end of war, for the opportunity to show kindness even to former enemies. When they released hands, Jake looked at Hans. "We got a tradition. Everyone says what they are thankful for." Around the table they went. Billy was thankful the war was over and his father had not been sent to fight. Tom was thankful for Ranger and for Mr. Muller teaching him better riding technique. Mary was thankful they could show kindness even to former enemies. The neighbors were thankful for good weather and healthy cattle. Jake spoke last before Hans. "I am thankful my brother's sacrifice at Pearl Harbor was not in vain. We beat tyranny, and now we can rebuild the world right. We can choose to do better." Then all eyes turned to Hans. His throat felt tight. He had practiced the words in his head, but speaking them aloud was different. "I am thankful." His English was better now after 4 months of daily use, but still halting. "For boots, for bacon, for this family who show me what America really is." He paused, gathering courage for the next part. "I fight against you for 7 years. I believe what my government tell me. I am wrong. About America. About war. About everything." His voice cracked. "I am sorry." Silence around the table. Then Mary reached across, squeezed his hand. "We forgive you, Hans." And Hans Muller, who had not cried in front of others since he was a child, who had survived combat and capture and 2 years of prison without breaking, broke. Tears ran down his face while Mary held his hand, and the Thompson family sat witness to the moment when former enemies became something else, something better. December arrived with cold rain and the reality of impending departure. Hans spent his evenings in the camp wood shop working on a project he had been planning for weeks. The wood was walnut salvaged from a fallen tree on Jake's property. Hans shaped it with tools the American supervisor had loaned him, using techniques his grandfather had taught him a lifetime ago. The jewelry box took shape slowly. 10 inches long, 6 inches wide, 4 inches deep, dovetailed joints at the corners, a hinged lid with brass hardware. The real artistry was in the inlay work. Hans cut pieces of lighter maple and darker cherry, creating a pattern that merged Texas stars with traditional German geometric designs. Two nations, two traditions, united in wood and craftsmanship. On the inside of the lid, he carved an inscription with a fine chisel. For Mary with thanks, Hans, February 1946. He made smaller items, too. Wooden horses for Billy and Tom carved from single pieces of oak, each about 6 inches tall. The detail work was intricate, manes, flowing legs, and mid-gallop expressions that somehow captured both power and gentleness. Klaus found him in the wood shop late one evening, polishing the jewelry box with linseed oil. That is beautiful. Hans held it up to the light, checking for imperfections. It is not enough, can never be enough, but is something. You are really considering going back to America after Germany, are you not? Hans set the box down carefully. I do not know. First I must go home. See my mother, help Anna. Maybe rebuild the bakery. Then, he shrugged, then I see what is possible. Klaus was quiet for a moment. I think you have already decided, you just have not admitted it yet. Perhaps Klaus was right. Perhaps the decision had been made the moment Hans accepted the boots, or the moment he shook Jake's hand, or the moment Mary forgave him at Thanksgiving. Perhaps the decision had been inevitable from the start, and everything since had just been Hans catching up to the truth his heart already knew. February 1946. The camp was emptying. The first groups of prisoners had already shipped out, returning to a Germany none of them recognized from the letters. Occupation zones, rationing, cities in ruins, a defeated nation learning to exist under the oversight of the victors. Hans received final letters from Anna. She had found their mother a small apartment in the British zone. Nothing special. 2 rooms, shared bathroom. But it was shelter and it was warm and it was better than the refugee camp. Anna was still cooking for British soldiers, still bringing home what food she could. They were surviving. That was all anyone could hope for now. The night before departure, Hans visited Jake's ranch one last time. He brought the jewelry box and the wooden horses wrapped in old newspaper. The family gathered in the living room fireplace, crackling, everyone trying not to think about the goodbye coming tomorrow. Hans handed Mary the package. She unwrapped it slowly, saw the box, gasped. Hans, this is not enough, he said quickly. You give me food, kindness, forgiveness. I give wood, is not equal. Mary opened the box, saw the inlay, worked the craftsmanship, ran her fingers over the smooth surfaces. Her eyes filled with tears. It is perfect. Billy and Tom opened their packages, found the horses, reacted with teenage attempts to mask genuine emotion. Billy held his horse up to the lamplight, examining the detail. This is incredible, Mr. Mueller. You keep forever, Hans said. Remember German prisoner who learned about America from Thompson family. Jake stood by the fireplace, hands in pockets, face carefully neutral. But Hans had learned to read the subtle signs, the set of Jake's shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. Jake Thompson was a man who felt deeply, but expressed it quietly. Hans, walk with me. They went outside into the cold February night. Stars blazed overhead, more stars than Hans had ever seen in Hamburg's wild city sky. They walked to the corral where Ranger stood, visible as a shadow against shadows. You still got my offer, Jake said. Come back when you are ready. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Does not matter. Job will be here. I do not know if I can. My mother needs me. Anna needs me. Germany needs people to rebuild. I know. Jake turned to face him. That is why I am offering. Good men rebuild. That is what the world needs now. You go do what you need to do for your family, for your country. Then if you want, you come back and build something here, too. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is a letter of recommendation. My name, my address, my phone number. It says you are honest, hardworking, deserving of opportunity. You show this to immigration officials, to potential employers, to anyone who questions you. You tell them Jake Thompson of Bryan, Texas, vouches for Hans Mueller of Hamburg, Germany. Hans took the envelope with shaking hands. I do not deserve this. War is over. Deserving has nothing to do with it. Kindness is not something you earn. It is something you give. Jake extended his hand. You are a good man, Hans. Do not forget that when the hard times come, and they will come, Germany will be difficult, but you are strong enough. They shook hands and then, surprising them both, embraced. Two men who had been enemies, who had no reason to trust each other, who had found something deeper than nationality, or uniform, or the propaganda that had tried to turn them into monsters. When they separated, both had tears on their faces visible in the starlight. March 15th, 1946. 200 German prisoners stood on the platform at the Bryan train station, waiting for the locomotive that would take them to New York, then to ships bound for Europe. American guards supervised, but the atmosphere was not tense. After 2.5 years, goodbyes had a strange quality. Not quite friendship, not quite enemy, something undefined that the war had created and the peace had complicated. Hans stood with his small pack of possessions. Prison uniforms to be returned on arrival in New York. The wooden diary he had kept since 1943. Anna's letters, and wrapped carefully in cloth the cowboy boots Jake had given him 10 months ago. The Thompson family drove up in their truck. All four of them climbed out and walked directly to Hans. Other prisoners watched this interaction with various expressions. Some understood, some did not. Keller, being shipped out in the same group, glared from 30 feet away, but said nothing. Mary hugged Hans first, which shocked him. Then Billish and in awkward teenage hugs, but genuine. Finally, Jake, who held him tight and spoke quietly into his ear. "You come back. That is not a request. It is a promise I am holding you to." Jake released him, stepped back, and pulled a package from the truck. Hans opened it. Inside was the pair of cowboy boots, cleaned and polished and resoled by a cobbler in Bryan. "You will need these. German winters are cold, and when you come back to Texas, you will need proper boots for ranch work." Hans tried to speak but could not. Jake also handed him a leather belt with a brass buckle shaped like the Texas star, and then an envelope. Hans opened it. Inside, $200 in pawn, more money than Hans had earned in the entire 2 years at camp. "Jake, I cannot." "You can and you will. You need this to rebuild your family's bakery. Take it. Pay it forward someday when you can." The train whistle blew. The conductor called for boarding. Hans looked at the Thompson family, at these Americans who had shown him dignity when they had every reason for revenge. "When bakery is rebuilt," Hans said, voice thick with emotion, "I come back, I promise. I will hold you to that, friend." They embraced one final time. Hans shook hands with Billy and Tom, thanked Mary, picked up his pack with the boots inside. He walked to the train, climbed aboard, found a seat by the window. As the train pulled away, Hans watched the Thompson family standing on the platform waving. He pressed his hand against the window, watched them grow smaller, watched them disappear. Klaus sat beside him. "You will really go back?" It was not a question. "Yes," Hans said, "I will really go back." Hamburg, April 1946. The city Hans remembered existed only in memory. The reality was rubble and ghosts. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. The Longaraya, where his father's bakery had stood, was a wasteland of broken brick and twisted metal. The church where he had been baptized was a hollow shell roof, gone walls scorched black. Hans found his mother in the British zone apartment Anna had secured. Greta Mueller was 62 but looked 80. The pneumonia had aged her, and grief had done the rest. When she saw Hans at the door, she cried and held him and said his name over and over like a prayer. Anna was thinner than he remembered, but strong. 28 years old now, her hands rough from cooking work, her eyes harder than before the war. She had survived by becoming practical, by letting go of softness. But when she saw Hans, some of that hardness melted. "You came home." "I came home." They sat in the small apartment, drinking ersatz coffee, and Hans told them about Texas, about Camp Hearn and Jake Thompson, and cowboy boots and Thanksgiving dinner, about learning that enemies could be kind, and that propaganda was lies, and that maybe possibly there was a way forward that did not involve bitterness. Greta held the $200 Jake had given him and wept. "This American who owes us nothing gives this. He says to rebuild the bakery. He says to pay it forward when I can." Anna looked at her brother. "Will you go back to America?" "First I rebuild here, then yes, I will go back." They used Jake's money and British reconstruction loans to clear the rubble where Wilhelm's bakery had stood. Hans worked alongside hired laborers carrying brick, pouring concrete framing walls. He used the carpentry skills Jake had taught him to build counters and shelves. He negotiated with British officials for rations and business permits. He learned the bureaucracy of a defeated nation slowly rebuilding under foreign oversight. The new bakery opened in September 1947. Muller and Sons Bakery Vichy. Sign read honoring Wilhelm, even though there were no sons to carry on, only Hans himself trying to resurrect something dead. The first customers were neighbors who remembered Wilhelm's bread. They came with British occupation scrip in American dollars and whatever payment they could manage. Hans made pumpernickel from Wilhelm's recipe, made rolls and dark bread, and eventually, when ingredients became available, the sweet pastries Hamburg had been famous for before the war. On the wall behind the counter, Hans hung the Texas Star belt buckle Jake had given him. Customers asked about it. Hans told them it was a gift from a friend, a reminder of kindness when he needed it most. Some customers nodded in understanding. Others looked uncomfortable. Not everyone was ready to forgive. Not everyone believed in moving forward. Every December, Hans wrote to Jake, long letters describing the bakery's progress, the city's rebuilding, Germany's slow transformation from defeated enemy to occupied territory to something that might eventually become a nation again. Jake wrote back, shorter letters about ranch life, about cattle prices, about Billy joining the army and Tom starting college, about Mary's health, about Texas weather, about the standing offer that never expired. In 1949, Greta Muller died peacefully in her sleep. She was 65. At her funeral, Hans told mourners about the American food packages that had kept her alive, about the former enemy nation that had shown mercy. Some people listened, others walked away. Anna married a British soldier in 1950, a good man who treated her well and helped run the bakery when Hans traveled. The business grew, Hans trained apprentices. The Muller name became associated with quality bread again. But every morning when Hans tied his cowboy boots, when he touched the Texas Star on the wall, he thought about Jake's words, "Good men build." And he thought about the promise he had made on a train platform 20 years ago. July 1966. Hans Muller was 49 years old, hair graying at the temples, hands scarred from decades of baking. The bakery was successful. His mother was at peace. Anna was happy with her British husband and 2 children. Germany had been rebuilt into something unrecognizable from the rubble of 1946. The divided nation was complicated and painful, but it was alive. Hans had saved money. He had arranged for Anna's husband to run the bakery for 6 months. He had applied for American visitor visa, and he had packed a small suitcase with clothes and gifts and the same cowboy boots he had been given 21 years ago. The leather was worn, now resoled twice, shaped perfectly to his feet, but still functional, still reminding him every day of kindness and promises. He brought his wife Helga, married in 1952, a baker's daughter from Bremen, who understood flour and ovens and the language of bread. And he brought his daughter Greta, 13 years old, named for his mother, curious and bright and eager to see this America her father talked about with such strange reverence. The plane landed in Houston. Hans rented a car, drove north to Bryan, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. What if Jake had moved? What if he had died? What if 20 years had erased whatever connection they had forged across the boundaries of war? But when Hans pulled up the long driveway to the Thompson Ranch, he saw the white farmhouse, the red barn, the corrals, and he saw an old man standing on the porch, gray-haired now, moving slower but unmistakably, Jake Thompson. Hans stepped out of the car. He was wearing the cowboy boots. Jake saw them and saw Hans, and his face broke into a smile that erased 20 years in an instant. "You kept them. I told you, German soldier keeps his word." They embraced on the porch while Helga and Greta watched, while Mary emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron, just like that first day in 1945. Jake was 63 now, Mary was 57, but their kindness had not aged. That week, Hans worked on the ranch every day, not for pay, but for joy. He taught Greta to ride Ranger, the second son of the original Ranger, who had died in 1958. They had evening barbecues where Hans told stories of the past 20 years. Local newspapers heard about the German POW returning to thank his former captor and ran stories that made Hans uncomfortable, but that spoke to something people wanted to believe about redemption. On the last evening before departure, Hans made his proposal. He wanted to open a second bakery in Texas, using German recipes and American business practices, hiring local people, building a bridge between the two nations through bread and honest work. "I cannot run it myself," Hans explained. "I have bakery in Hamburg, But Greta, she will study at Texas A&M. She will learn business. She will run American Bakery when she is old enough. Jake looked at 13-year-old Greta, then back at Hans. You are serious. You gave me boots and showed me kindness and offered me a future when I had none. Now I give back. I build something that lasts. 3 years later, Muller's German-American bakery opened in College Station. Greta Muller attended Texas A&M, studied business, learned to bake from her father during summer breaks. The bakery became a local institution known for pumpernickel and rye and the strange story of its origin. Hans visited every year. Jake and Hans remained friends until Jake died in 1977 at age 74. At the funeral, Hans delivered the eulogy in accented English, telling mourners that this man had been his enemy, had become his teacher, had shown him that America's true strength was not weapons, but kindness. The years passed. Hans trained 40 apprentices in Hamburg. The scholarship fund he established, the Thomson-Muller Exchange, sent German students to Texas A&M and Texas students to Hamburg's culinary schools. The boots worn and resold and ancient hung in both bakeries behind glass, a reminder of transformation. Hans Muller died in 2006 at age 89 in Hamburg. His obituary ran in the New York Times. German POW who found hope in Texas boots. At his request, he was buried wearing the boots Jake had given him 61 years earlier. Today, Muller's Bakery operates in Hamburg and College Station. Both locations display the Texas Star Belt buckle. The original cowboy boots rest in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, beside Jake's letter of recommendation and Hans's diary from Camp Hearn. The story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of kindness can transform enemies into friends, hatred into hope, war into peace. The next time you see someone suffering, even if they once stood against you, remember the cowboy who gave his enemy boots and the German who learned that America's greatest weapon was never force but compassion. Sometimes the most powerful victories are not won on battlefields. They are won at dinner tables, on horse rides, in the simple act of treating every human with dignity. That is the America Hans Muller discovered in Texas. That is the America worth remembering. That is the America we must continue to build. One act of kindness at a time, one pair of boots at a time, one choice at a time, to see the human before the uniform, the person before the enemy, the future before the past.